Welcome back to Key Connections for Educators. I'm really excited to continue our conversation about social learning. Last episode, we talked a little bit about the importance of social learning and the fact that we're always doing it. In this episode, Hannah and I really want to lean into some of the experiences that we've had either in the classroom or online in virtual environments, or even when we're designing learning activities, and think, if we know how important social learning is, how can we skip the lecture and actually embed that into what we do? Hannah, what are some considerations whether we're virtual or we're in a traditional classroom?
There's 5 major considerations that we should think about. First is structure. So providing clear expectations and clear roles to ensure that there's balanced participation. So everyone's included, everyone's involved, and everyone knows what we're doing in that social learning activity. Then there's inclusion that kind of piggybacks off of the structure, but really ensuring the activities are designed to include diverse perspectives and accommodate different learning styles. The third is feedback and fostering a culture of constructive and respectful peer feedback really can help us as educators continue to tailor our activities to meet the needs of our students, particularly in those more social settings. And then fourth is technology. Here in our virtual world, that's so important. But whether we're in person in the classroom or whether we are in a remote classroom, really selecting platforms that facilitate easy communication and collaboration. And that goes with structure, really setting those expectations of how to integrate the platform in an easy to use way for our students and ourselves. And then finally is facilitation, monitoring those interactions to guide discussions and ensure accountability, because we want our learning to land with our students. And creating those interactions and ensuring that accountability helps us know that those students are taking the content that they're learning and they're actually digesting it and they're working with it in a new way.
Yeah, it's not always just the classroom. If you have a really good relationship that's bred inside of a traditional classroom or even asynchronously, think about how that just springboards you into your career. I know that there's people that I have in my life, you one of them, but other folks as well, that I continue to use in a social learning aspect because I had such a great experience as a learner with that other person, that it's this camaraderie of learning together that creates these long-term relationships. So we get the opportunity to facilitate that as educators and to really help people think through that. And how many friends do we probably both have from college,
Yeah, great point.
right?
A lot.
Or
Yeah.
high school, right? You're in a community of learning, you're all going through something similar, even if you're not always on the same, career path, you keep in touch with these people because you've got these friendships that are built around this social learning structure, like a college or a high school. So that's obviously a really good way to look at that. So,
I love that. Yeah. So I was thinking that for today's episode, we could explore many different ways, strategies, ideas of how to integrate social learning into our classroom experiences, whether we're in person or whether we're virtually, and talk through some of our own experiences and some stories to give our audience members a peek into how we've done social learning, and then to give them ideas of how they can then integrate it into their classrooms as well. So, when we think about collaborative learning activities, what first comes to mind is group projects,
Mm.
assigning tasks that require group problem solving, such as creating presentations or solving case studies. And partner simulation activities has really been a tool that I've used in onboarding for new hires to experience that pretend group with a partner to go through the steps and talk through the complexities, whether it's of a case or whether it's of an actual task that they will do. And having that simulated experience with a partner really helps them in being able to talk through the how to's.
I like that you said simulated experience because immediately I thought role play, and people hate the word role play because they have this, I don't know, this context, so they just don't wanna do it, right? But if you say simulated experience, that might make it a little more palatable, especially for our adult learners. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that to
Absolutely.
me, yeah, I like that. So simulated experience. I also like asking questions where there aren't necessarily right answers and having a group problem solve through that, and then having them share out afterwards. So I can remember back to when I was working in a life insurance role, and we would have an activity where groups would actually have a budget for a family and different insurance products, and they'd have to figure out how to pair those budgets with the right products. And oftentimes you'd have groups that would come up with very different suggestions, and they could talk about those with each other. And sometimes group A was actually persuaded that group B's line of thinking was better, but other times they'd walk away and say, "No, there's not a right answer here. As long as we were listening to what the client needed and got them something that matched, there's not necessarily going to be a perfect match every time." And so I like those critical thinking activities too, where you can see the complexities of real life come into play and then get to hear the line of thinking that other people have when they're working through those.
I love that. And that also could go for a K-12 classroom as well. Oftentimes we think there has to be a right answer, but it, utilizing the idea of social learning to help our students think together, problem solve together, and also realize there may not be one right answer helps prepare them for the real world experiences that they'll have in the future.
Do you ever do the egg drop?
I know exactly what it is, but I never did it myself. Yeah.
I would never want it. I'll just put that out there.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see when you have a group project where people have to drop the egg from the top of the building or top of a tall ladder, and it has to hit the ground inside of a container of some sort and not break. And there are all sorts of different solutions to this. So that's a great example of not one right answer. As long as the egg doesn't break.
Right, right. So another great social learning strategy is peer teaching. And this is when students teach concepts to each other, and that enhances understanding and retention.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorites. And the reason why is because it's Bloom's highest level. So, for those of you familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, the highest level is to create, using the new information learned to create something new. Not only do you need to understand the content, but you need to be able to understand it in a way that then you can explain it back to other people. And that is huge as far as the true learning, because you really are applying the learning in a new way and then having to teach it back to someone else. I'm thinking of two ideas here. One of the activities that I did when I was a GP operations trainer, we would have new hire training and we had to learn product lines. And a lot of these products were complicated, they had complex layers to them. And so each student in the new hire training was responsible for putting together a deck to teach back to the group about that particular product. And so they'd have time to prepare, but then they would research their particular product line and then they were responsible for teaching back in that small group setting. And I noticed how they really ingested that material, digested that material in a much more thorough way because they knew they were going to be on and having to present this information. They couldn't just fly by the seat of their pants.
Yeah. Like there's a phrase, the best way to learn something is to teach it to someone else.
Yeah.
So asking a participant to do a teach back is an extraordinary way, and it really does go into that Bloom's taxonomy because of that higher level of processing information. It's not just memorizing a fact, it's really having to understand the nuances of that fact in order to describe it to someone else. The other advantage of something like this is sometimes you unleash the creativity of a group in a way that you may not have. And I have seen some interesting presentations when we give people the freedom to teach back. I have seen skits, I have seen videos, I've seen songs. Sometimes they're more traditional demos or just a lecture, but I really think it's fun to see a group that gets it and then thinks about how they want to learn it or just wants to challenge themselves to do something a little more interesting. And you really see some creativity unleashed. I have seen that go wrong as well, so you do have to put some parameters around it. There's some folks that really lean into the creativity a little too much and the teaching gets lost, but there's been some profoundly interesting, fun, and informative teachbacks that I've seen over the years by allowing people to have the freedom to do what they want as opposed to having to do what I want.
I understand. I think that goes back to the structure piece. As long as we provide that structure right from the get go, whether it's a time segment that you're going to teach back or it's this many slides in your deck, I think that really helps to curb some of the risk and help them play within their strengths and their creativity within those boundaries to help with that for sure. Having students teach back also helps with if we ourselves don't want to be lecturing. So, for instance, I didn't stand up and lecture about each product line for an hour and a half. I was able to offload that onto my students, and then my students then took on some of that. And I was able to coach them through or speak to something that maybe wasn't correct. But oftentimes they then took it on and took the seriousness of it because they wanted to be an expert in teaching back their material.
You can act as that facilitator. You're giving the instructions with a clear structure. And then at the end or during, you can facilitate learning by asking follow-up questions, making clarifying statements, throwing it out to the rest of the group and hearing the reaction. And I think that's really thoughtful.
And this can also be done in a elementary school classroom. So when I taught 4th grade and we were learning about key state locations, I would assign one location to each of my students. And then the expectation was to create a 2-slide PowerPoint to present and teach the class about the location that they had researched. And that was a great motivator because they knew they were going to have to perform, if you will, in front of their peers. And so it put the fire under them to do a great job and to get excited because they were going to be sharing about a cool place with their peers.
Maybe the point of this is that I was in 4th grade. I think I had to memorize states and capitals. But what we're saying here is you're still going to have to memorize states and capitals, but you're going to do a deeper dive on one of them.
That's right.
And that really opens up the world for me to learn what I want. And it's self-directed, but it's also social because I might have other people that have lived there in the class and I could ask them some questions, or I get to see what other people are presenting and I get to ask questions about their presentation. And so that really does create a little bit more interest in why I'm learning about the states and capitals because this is the one I want to do. I can remember my kids actually had to do research on a state and then the capital, and each one of them had picked different ones. And we've actually visited those places together as a family to help that come to life for them. So it doesn't just have to stay in the classroom, it can even go outside of the classroom and become something larger as a family. So that's been really fun.
Oh, I love that. Oh, another great way to break up lecture is the think, pair, share activity. And this is very simple, but this is when students first think individually about a question or a prompt, and then they discuss their ideas with a partner, maybe sitting next to them, and then they finally share with the larger group. And this is really ideal for breaking up longer lectures to immediately think about, to apply and consider the information that was just shared. And having those discussions helps students process the information as well. I encourage those of us who have more of those longer presentations to consider where could we intersperse a think pair share activity throughout to help with maybe it's a prompt for application, for behavior change, even self reflection prompts.
I love this topic because there are going to be some people in your classroom that actually want to think before they share. And there's going to be other ones that actually think by sharing, like me.
Me? Me too. I was going to share that too.
So I think what we're doing here is we're actually honoring those that like to think first, giving them a self-reflection question, allowing them the space to actually work non-socially so that they can actually then become a social learner. And that really honors that learner as well. And I can remember doing a sales training and it was well designed. I didn't design it myself, wish I had, but for each one of those core concepts inside of a sales pitch or inside of the sales process, there would be a space set aside for journaling. We want you to write down a couple of ideas that you have based on what we've just heard. And then after that, you'd share it with a peer. And that I felt was really well done. And it's something that I hadn't integrated prior to that. And I've looked for ways to integrate that afterwards because it really does give you the opportunity to have, I think, a little more thoughtful conversation afterwards. I do want to just point out that depending on the length of your class, this might be one of those shorter activities. Here's the concept. We're going to journal about it for 3 minutes We're gonna have a conversation you're gonna share with your peers for 2. So it really turns into a 5-minute piece between segments, and that really does do a great job of breaking up the monotony of a long lecture. So I like that, but it doesn't get out of hand where you have 3 people that are done talking about it and they're on their cell phone while everyone else is discussing it.
Yeah, for sure. One of my favorite ways to learn is to either read something or learn something, and then I immediately want to talk to someone about it. And I can remember when I was in a teacher workshop myself with another sixth grade teacher teammate, and we actually got in trouble because we were talking in the back of the classroom during the
Right.
workshop. And yet, what we were talking about was immediately we were thinking, oh, that's such a cool idea. This is how we would integrate it into our content and into our classrooms and into what we were doing. But keeping that in mind that maybe students talking during your lecture or during your workshop may not be the worst idea because you never know what they're talking about. We were actually talking about how to apply it and bring it back to our world.
Yeah, a newer facilitator would probably get really bothered by that, or a newer trainer because they're trying to concentrate on the content and 2 people are just talking in the back of the room. But a seasoned facilitator is able to notice that and see it and actually build for it and say, "You know what? I understand that Hannah and Nate are in the background because 'cause they're really excited about this and they're actually planning something, but in the process, they're missing this next 3 bullet points. So how can I create the space so they can actually talk?"
And I think pair share allows that space to be interspersed in a lecture so that we know that's coming and that's my time to talk with my teammate.
Now, on a grander scale, we also have classroom discussions, which are a larger version of a think, pair, share, and a more think out loud, I'd say.
Mhm.
A friend of mine named Matt Warnke says that the role of a good facilitator is leading participants down the path of self discovery. And so he uses a lot of questions in order to generate that self discovery as opposed to just telling people things. So I know you've used a lot of discussion in the past. Where does that come from in your life? And what are some of the experiences you've had with that?
So, for those of us well versed in education, that's the Socratic method. Not necessarily telling, but bringing those answers out of our students. And so, formulating those questions and those prompts to get our students thinking so that they're actually coming up with what we want them to discover. And I love that quote from Matt because it's exactly what our role is. The classroom discussion is one of those things where everyone is expected to be involved. And so you can't just hide or be a wallflower if you know the expectation is you also need to chime in and join into the discussion. And one of the ways that I facilitated this was with my new hires and they knew I'd have a deck of cards with their name on each of them. And before the class, they would answer questions on their own and come to class prepared with those answers. And then I, as a facilitator, would read out the question, select a card with a student's name on it to share their answer. And most of those answers were open ended. So that was because of the nature of the role I was training and they would share their answers and then others would join in to add on to the answer if needed or to clarify. And I would rotate through all the students answering a question. So everyone knew they were going to be on at some point. So they came prepared by answering all of the questions and then were aware, hey, I might get called on here because my name hasn't been called yet for this card. And that was really key. Another little tip that I've used since teaching elementary school is a question that all of us can adapt. And it's what makes you think that? So when a student shares an answer, going further and saying, I love that. So what makes you think that? And it is another way of asking why, but going a little bit deeper and giving that student like freedom and permission to explore why did they actually answer the way that they did?
Yeah. Or even saying, I wonder why that is. Almost like you don't know.
Yes. Yes. Kind of inspiring that curiosity a little bit.
I like that you said, I love that. What makes you think that? Because it really didn't put that person on defense. Because sometimes when somebody gives an answer and they immediately get a follow up question, they feel like they're being challenged. And then that's shutting them down. They're gonna get in that fight or flight mentality or freeze, and they're not gonna know what to make of it. But when you give them that affirmation, "Wow, that is so insightful. What makes you think of that?" Or, "Like,
Mhm.
tell me more about that," or, "Wonder why that is." It really creates that place where they feel safe,
Yeah.
that mental, that emotional, and that psychological security that, "Okay, I got the right answer." Not that there's always right answers, but I'm safe, and the person just wants to know more, not because 'cause they're questioning whether or not my answer is the right one or not.
Yeah, because there is that fear. They went ahead, they shared their answer out loud in front of others, and there's a vulnerability to that. I agree. But if they do share the wrong answer, sometimes we don't even have to say anything. It's our body language that's creating that psychological safe space. And then with that, what makes you think that? What's actually happened is when a student gives a wrong answer by talking through what made them think that, sometimes they realize, I don't think that was the right answer after all. And it gives them an opportunity to backtrack into their line of logic of how they came to that conclusion.
Nice. That's so insightful. I hadn't thought about that opposite of letting somebody do that, and that is a challenge because of that psychological safety. No one wants to look bad in front of their peers.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of this social learning could also have that double-edged sword where you could really quickly ruin a learner's experience if they feel shame in the midst of a social learning experience, right? I remember actually getting some feedback after a session that said that they didn't appreciate that I had called on them out loud. I hadn't done what you were doing, where I gave them a chance to prep for it first. I was throwing out a question. They hadn't had a chance to think about it. I'm now calling on Hannah, who's doesn't have anything she wants to offer. It wasn't Hannah, but now she feels ashamed that she's in front of the group and doesn't have something of value to add and has to come up with something on the spot. And it's a very uncomfortable situation. I took that as feedback that I need to do more of what Hannah's doing, where I'm actually prepping some of those conversations first, letting people come to the session prepared, and then randomly calling on them as okay because they at least have had the chance to think through the material first. And that's another way of that psychological safety and inclusion for different learning styles. Some people like me don't care to get it wrong. I'll just say it out loud. I'll get it wrong and then I'll backtrack it. No big deal. But there's other people that social environment is intimidating and we need to honor that. So I love that. That was great. And I need to remind myself to do that more often.
Yeah. And again, the structure. So, this was also a routine activity. We would start out our class every day with about 20 minutes of that QA class discussion. So, students knew that expectation and that routine gave them a sense of safety of, okay, we know what's coming, we know what's expected of us. And that really helped too, because it was a routine piece too. It wasn't just, once.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Another one that I love to do in the classroom is games. Gamification has been a little overused, if I'm be quite frank. Not everything has to have a game, and not everything that's a game is a good game. I really like ones that simulate work experiences. Those are really well done. Just personally, I started playing a game that's not necessarily work related on my phone over the holidays. And this is a mobile game that I spend probably too much time on. But the complexities of the social aspect of this game was something I wasn't expecting. The core of the game is somewhat individual, but then there's some different initiatives that you need to work on as a team, and there's not instructions. And so as a team, we have to figure out how to do this together. And so there's chat. And we've created a Discord where we can actually talk to each other and we share back information. And sometimes it's wrong and we have to revise it. And through that process, we have this really cool community of probably about 50 to 100 of us playing this game on a team, and it's been so interesting to see those connections built. So that to me, when you have a shared goal that really lines up with an objective that you're trying to accomplish, and the team gets a chance to really figure things out together, and it's competitive because people like to win, those are so fun.
Yeah, well, that also builds more trust
Mm,
between teammates, between the students in the class. So I see that as a really great side benefit as well. I think of scavenger hunt. escape room type games where you're learning a new tool or you're looking at different aspects, scavenger hunts, and kind of that escape room mentality of working together to figure something out is huge because then it's that hands-on learning as well. You're not just given the information, you're actually having to go search it out yourself and you're working with a teammate to do that. It's great for us too to transform dull or complex content into games to learn new information. We had a very complex, boring tool that a lot of our IEMs had to learn, and the scavenger hunt activity ended up being one of my students' favorite activities of the whole training. And it was as they explored this very complex tool together.
I love that. I also think that a good game has a level of risk involved in it.
Sure does.
And so sometimes creating some unknowns is so rewarding. So you want to have structure, make sure they know that the unknowns are coming. But I had a great game that we played where we had some different salespeople put together a different pitch based on the information they had. But then we didn't know what the scenario was going to end with. Even the facilitator didn't know because there was a little wheel we'd spin, and based on the outcome of that wheel, it might be completely different for this team versus that team, which created such a really interesting place because that's how sales is.
Yes.
You could do all the prep in the world, but then somebody just gets a lucky break. Now, if they got the lucky break, but they had the wrong product, they still might not win the game. So
There were
it,
just different risk factors that were all playing at the
that's
same time.
right. So are you prepared so that when that lucky break comes, you actually can maximize that opportunity? And that is where a good game, you don't wanna reward people that have bad information on just getting a lucky pull of the cards, but you do wanna reward somebody who's got it right, and it just happens that it falls on that spot at the right time. Those are really rewarding places. So, I think when you can create good opportunities for a little bit of an unknown, even as a facilitator, where you don't know where this is gonna go, that just creates that interest in me as well because I don't know how this game's gonna end up. This could go a completely different direction. The last place team might just spring to first place at the end because they just happen to hit on the right things at the right time with the right information. And that's a really fun way to incorporate that, and it keeps people engaged as well, and as long as the prize isn't extraordinary for the winners and terrible for the losers, it works out pretty well.
I love that. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Key Connections for Educators. If you found value in today's discussion on social learning, whether you're teaching in a K-12 classroom, higher ed, or leading corporate training, we hope you're walking away with strategies you can start using right away. There were just so many practical ideas and powerful stories to share that Nate and I decided to split this episode into two parts. We didn't want to rush through these insights, especially when it comes to the real life ways we've seen these strategies come to life with our own learners. So make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode, where we will dive even deeper into how structure, inclusion, feedback, facilitation, and technology shape the social learning experience, both in person and virtually. And we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with your favorite takeaway or something you're excited to try in your own teaching. If you've got questions or stories of your own, we're always here for a conversation. Until next time, keep building those key connections and keep learning together. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel and help more educators discover impactful strategies that make a real difference.